My name is Katie Marachko, and I am the designer here at Pure Periwinkle, and I have a great fun project for you today that is achievable even for a beginner, and it takes very minimal amount of supplies. All right, time for step one. We're gonna make our own bias binding today. I prefer to make my own. You can use double fold bias tape that you buy in the store. It's perfectly fine, but I have found that it doesn't give the nice finish that choosing your own cotton woven will do. So very quickly, using a fat quarter, we're gonna use our straight edge, our quilting ruler, and we're gonna find a 45-degree angle. And so if you're unfamiliar with the way fabric goes, we have our selvage on this end. It usually has the printed words. This particular fabric is by Free Spirit, and it is called Rambling Rose. And so you wanna find that selvage edge, and this is very nice on these quilting rulers. Most of them you might not be able to see, but they have these lines that show you the different angles. And so here's my 45-degree angle. I'm gonna use that line. There's two of them, one going this way and one going this way, so I'm gonna use this one. And I'm gonna line that up with my selvage, and that's gonna give me my 45-degree angle. Now, why is that important? The way that the fabric moves, if you do it on the straight of grain, so if I just make a long strip going straight up the selvage, it will not stretch and move in the same way that on the bias will do. So if we do it on the bias, it'll move different ways, and especially as we start to go around this corner, it becomes super important. For these pieces, you could absolutely use a strip that you've done on the straight of grain, but we're gonna have to do one at an angle anyway, so there'll be plenty left over. So like I said, I'm gonna line up that 45-degree, and I'm gonna make my first cut. I might go out of the shot there, but I'm just gonna hold my ruler down and make my whole cut across the entire fat quarter. I know this can feel like it is a waste, but the reality is you can get two of these pot pinchers out of two fat quarters, and so make a pair. Super cute. So in the pattern, I tell you how big to make your bias binding. I will keep a couple secrets here because I want you to buy the pattern, you know? So I'm gonna make my second long cut and make my very first strip of bias binding. This will be enough for the piece that's going to go around the entire, it'll be more than enough to go around the entire pot pincher. Now I've still got another long stretch, so if I am gonna make two pot pinchers out of this, I wanna make sure I get another long strip. You can piece together, perfectly fine. I've done it a lot of times. It's just nice when you don't have to do that. I don't particularly care for doing that too much. So I'm gonna line up my marks on my ruler with the cut edge of my fabric and make another cut. So there I've got two nice big long pieces of bias binding that I'm gonna use for two pot holders. Now I need a couple of smaller ones just I'm calling these our finger sleeves. So we need a couple of small ones for our finger sleeves, so I'm just gonna go ahead and do those as well. All right, let's move on to quilting our pot pincher. So per the pattern instructions, you are gonna wanna cut a generous amount of your main fabric. So a little bit more, we're gonna be trimming it down. And you're also gonna need your piece of Insel Bright. We are gonna make a little bit of a sandwich here, and we're gonna use our sticky and stinky temporary basting spray to hold our sandwich in place while we do our quilting. So we're going to take one piece of our main fabric, lay it right side down. We're going to use our basting spray. Usually takes a little bit of shaking. I'm kind of running out, so we'll see if we get through this. And per the instructions, spray. So just a light dusting. We're going to use some more of that in just a second. We're going to take our layer of Insulbright, set it down on top, and smooth it out without moving anything because everything is sticky underneath it. And we've got one more spray to do. Just leave it there. Now we're going to spray over our Insulbright and take our other piece of main fabric and wrong side down, layer it on top. I find that smoothing it out with your hand and pressing it down is really helpful. Make sure that you don't have any wrinkles. There we go. So very carefully, I'm gonna peel that puppy up off of my sticky cardboard. Fold that sticky cardboard up and set it to the side. We are done with this temporary basting spray. This really does make your project entirely easier, so I highly recommend it. So that's our first step. Now we have to quilt it. And so a couple things. You can do this freehand. You can just do it. It does not have to be perfect. Nobody is going to scrutinize how straight your lines are, or are they all an inch apart or whatever. But if you find it helpful, and I do, you can draw on your lines. And so I'm going to use that same quilting ruler. I'm also going to use one of my disappearing friction pens. And I didn't test this. You might want to test it ahead of time, see if it actually disappears for you. I'm going to live dangerously. So using whatever angle you want, I find it looks prettier when it's at an angle. I'm going to line up my quilting ruler from one side to the other, and I'm just going to draw my line. I like to quilt every 1 inch, so I'm just going to move my quilting ruler over 1 inch and line it up on the line I just drew, and make another line, and do that until I have run out of surface area. So once I've done it all the way one direction, I'm going to flip it and complete. So I'm just doing lines going the same direction, just doing the other half. There we go. So now I've done lines this way. I want it to be kind of a diamond pattern. So I'm just going to rotate my my project, and I'm going to take these horizontal markings on my quilting ruler and line them up with the lines that I have made on my project. This is going to give me nice little squares that kind of appear like diamonds. First off, we're going to lengthen our stitch length. It'll make it go by faster, and it will help the layers to not shift quite as much. Personally, what I like to do is go down my project one direction, just turn it around and go back the other way, and repeat it until I've done all my lines. I choose to not clip my threads because we are going to trim this down in the next step, and all of those threads will be clipped at that time. It'll just save us a little bit of work. My project is now quilted. Now that we have quilted our pot pincher, we are going to trim it to the correct size. You can either use a quilting ruler or the template that is provided in your instructions. I'm going to use the quilting ruler because I find it to be easier. Next, after trimming it to size, we want to round the corners. So grabbing your corner rounding template, use any pen you want. It does not need to be disappearing. It can be something that's permanent, but line up the top of your curve and the sides of your curve and use your marking tool to get that curve on the side. Turn it around and do the same for the other side. Then taking your scissors, we'll just trim the edges to get that nice rounded edge. For this piece, the finger sleeves, we need two that are backed with a woven interfacing such as SF101 or Woven Fuse. Although this is kind of optional, it does give a little bit more of a sturdy feel to your fabric, but two sides is plenty. If you did all four of these, it feels a little bit heavy to me. So go ahead and just do two without interfacing and two with. We are going to make little sandwiches here, and so with one that is interfaced, two that is interfaced, you're going to lay wrong sides together down on your surface, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take some of our bias binding. Some people would be very tempted to go ahead and iron this binding, but I learned from the queen of binding by Annie Unrain, that if you don't iron it, it actually ends up looking better. So what I'm going to do with this small piece of bias binding is just fold it wrong sides together so that the long edges match. So the right side's on the outside. And I'm going to line that up with one raw edge of my little sandwich. And using these little babies, my Wonder Clips, I'm just going to clip it in place. Now, if you're using directional fabric, you want to be mindful that where it's going to end up, let me clip this and I'll show you, where these are going to end up on our finished pot pincher is one of the bias bindings will be on the bottom and one will be on the top. So as you look at it, if I had directional print, let's say there was human figures on here, let's say head is up here, feet is down here, I would want it, want to make sure that one of them has the bias binding where the feet are, but I'd want one bias binding where the head is so that we don't get an upside down man down here. So when I go to clip these, I want to make sure if it's directional that one is up and one is down. The other thing you might want to consider is what I'm having you do is pin your bias binding to the back side of your finger sleeves. So is there one side that you like better, that the graphics are cuter, it's more centered, you know, whatever. Just make sure that it's on the side that your bias binding is not clipped to. So this will be the right side. This is what will be shown here. All right, sewing with our binding on the top. Remember, this is the wrong side of our fabric and this is the right side of our fabric. We're gonna sew from the edge 1/4 of an inch. So back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. All we're gonna do is flip it up and over to the right side of our project and pin in place or clip in place. So that you can see, here's the back of our project, and then our bias binding flips over the front, and it should cover up our stitches that were done here at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine now, and this free side that is got the fold is what I'm going to sew down. I'm going to sew it down at about 1/8 of an inch, or just kind of close to that folded edge. It really doesn't matter where. I like mine to be pretty tight, and so you might take note of that as well. So back stitch at the beginning and the end. Smoothing out your binding, making sure it looks nice, since this will be the visible edge. I'll go ahead and clip my threads and show you my work. So there we go. Now that you've completed sewing your finger sleeves, it's time to round the edge. So grab your corner rounding template and your finger sleeve. We're going to match up the rounded edge to the raw edge of your finger sleeve. Your bias binding should be aligned with the straight edge of your corner rounding template. Line up the sides with the raw sides of your sleeve as well. Taking any kind of marking tool, because we're not going to see this, go ahead and trace the outside of that rounded template. Grab your fabric scissors and trim off the corners following the line that you just created. Repeat for your second finger sleeve. All right, now it's time to assemble your pot pincher. Take your main quilted body panel and determine which side you want to be featured on the back and which side maybe that you could just cover up a little bit more of. For me, either side will do, but what I'm going to choose is there's this rose that's right here in the middle, and I think that might be cute to have popping between my two finger sleeves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have that side be face up, and this side, which will be without the finger sleeves, face down. Taking my finger sleeves, making sure I have them face up. So this is the side that we just sewed in our last step. So the very last step, this is what's going on top. I'm going to line up my rounded edges on both of these. Make sure it's all straight and use my clips to clip in place. Now this is optional, but it's not a bad idea to keep things from shifting around at all. Take it over to your sewing machine and base stitch your finger sleeves on. A base stitch is a longer length, and it's 1/8 of an inch from the outside of your project, so it's going to get covered up. No one's ever going to see it. Okay, so now that you have base stitched your finger sleeves onto your main panel, which is a great way to practice that curve in a place that no one's ever going to see. So we have that, and now it's time to prepare our long bias binding strip. So we've cut it to length per our instructions. We're going to take it and fold it right sides together and align the short edge, and then sew at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to make sure to backstitch at the front and the back of this stitch so that it doesn't come undone. Okay, now that you have sewed your bias binding together, you just need to finger press it. So just take your finger, run it across the sewn seam, and then turn it right side out. You're going to take your completed main panel and put the finger sleeves right side down. If you want, you can make quarter markings on both your main panel and on your bias binding strip. You just do that by taking the seam, kind of making that one edge, make a mark at the opposite side, then have those two marks, the seam and the mark that you just made, kiss, and then fold it in half again. So then we've got another marking right here and another marking right here. With your main panel, what you'll do is, remember this from kindergarten, we're gonna fold our project in hamburger and then fold it hot dog, and we're gonna mark the creases on all of those. So hamburger, mark, mark, and then hot dog, mark, mark. And what that'll do is when we go to line up our bias binding, we can take the quarter markings on our binding and the quarter markings on our main panel and line those up, and then we just have to kind of fiddle in between those little marks instead of fiddling with the whole thing. I have done this so many times that I don't feel like I really need to do that. So I'm not going to right now, but you get the idea. So we're gonna take our bias binding now and we're gonna fold it all wrong sides together, meeting the raw edge. Take your clips, just hold it in place. Again, don't take this to the iron. You're gonna find that you have a lot more flexibility with your bias binding if you choose not to iron it. So line up those raw edges, put some clips in place all the way around. Just a few. We're going to add some more when we attach this to our project, but it's just kind of nice to have them to hold it in place while we get it situated. Okay. So right here is my first quarter marking. This is my seam. I'm going to take that seam and I want to put it in the quarter marking that's here in the center of my project, in this straightaway. So I'm just going to line up the raw edge of my bias binding with the raw edge of my main panel and clip in place. Now if I have my quarter markings, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to find, making sure this isn't twisted up, I'm going to find my quarter marking on my bias binding, find my quarter marking on my project, and clip it in place. Again, find my quarter marking on my bias binding, line it up with my quarter marking on my project, and clip it in place. And the last one, clipping it in place. Now that's not quite enough clips for me. That might be for you. I'm not the clip police. I'm not going to come and check. So whatever works for you, but I find it much more helpful to go ahead and do some other ones. Now it's real important that your raw edges align. You don't want to clip it way inside. You want those to be all aligned nicely. Now if there's any part of your project that you're going to do any kind of pulling or stretching, you really don't want to do much of that. But if there is some pulling, you want it to be on the straightaway. If you end up pulling it tight on the curve, it ends up not being enough fabric to get over the edge and get it where you need to be. It can also make your project kind of start to curl. So if you need to do any kind of tugging at all, you want it to be right here with these few inches of the straightaway. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish clipping my project in place. And once I get all of these clips in place, I'm just gonna evaluate whether there's any part of my project that has a lot of excess fabric or any part of my project that I've had to really pull. And I might want to kind of shift the fabric a little bit. I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I am going to sew at 1/4 of an inch all the way around, making sure to backstitch at the start and the stop. If you are not super confident in your 1/4 of an inch, it is better for you to be a little bit on the shy side than taking too much of a seam allowance. So if you're a little under a 1/4 of an inch, it's better than if you're over a 1/4 of an inch. And the reason for that is it is so much easier to go back and add some stitching to it to get up to the 1/4 of an inch than it is to have to pick it with a seam ripper. Nobody likes to do that, right? So if you're especially a little concerned on the curves that you might not do a great 1/4 of an inch, go try shooting for a little bit under. Okay, it's now time for us to stitch our bias binding on. This is when I'm going to use my Stiletto by Annie. This can help to keep things in place and keep your fingers away from your moving needle. So I really like this, especially when we take our bias binding to the front of our project. This will really come in handy. Another thing that might be helpful is if you're a little concerned about going around the corners, is a smaller stitch length will actually give you a little bit more control. It gives you a lot more opportunities to adjust your sewing as you go. If you have a longer stitch length, you just don't have as many opportunities if you go astray. So a smaller stitch length, nothing crazy, just a little bit smaller is better than longer, okay? So what I'm gonna do is start at one of my long straight areas. I'm gonna align my project with my 1/4 inch. And remember, it's very important that all of your raw edges stay aligned. So like right here, I've got extra stuff here. So when I get to this place, I'm just gonna make sure I get it all the way over to the edge so that my bias binding looks nice in the end. So starting with a couple back stitches just to lock our stitch in place. Now we're gonna go. Now if you have any like little wrinkles or creases or anything, you just want to kind of smooth those as you go. You don't want any folds in your fabric to get sewn down. You can go slow around the corners. Remember, less than a 1/4 of an inch if you're not super certain is better than too much. Using my stiletto to get, now it's both of my folds of fabric, not just the top one, that I want to make sure is all the way over. Smoothing as I go. Around the outside corner. Moving my clips out of the way as I go. Remember, you can use pins if you want. That's totally fine. Get into another corner. I don't usually have this cutting mat on my sewing machine. Gets a little in the way. So coming up to the beginning here, another back stitch, clip our threads, pull our stuff off. All right, so now we're going to take our bias binding and flip it over to the other side. Smoothing it out with our fingers, checking to see how things are going when we line it up over here. Highly recommend, before you move on to any next step, to go ahead and use your binder clips to lay it down in place. So I'm going to go all the way around, binder clip it in place. Now if it just lays really nicely, it just is not. We're going to blame nerves for this again. If it is not laying nicely, I've got a really great tip for you, and I'm glad you've hung in there for this long, because this might be the tip you were looking for. All right, just kind of tugging it. Again, we didn't iron this. This gives us so much more freedom as we do this. Yeah, wow. My seam allowance was off. I don't usually use this foot. I wonder if that's part of it. I usually use a little tiny skinny foot because I love it for my 1/8 of an inch. So see how much it's like, it's not covering? There's my stitches. I want it to go all the way to my stitches. Wow, that's off. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna peel this back, and I'm gonna take my scissors, and I am going to very carefully just trim down this edge of my project. I want to keep a nice rounded edge. Don't want like big gouges in it or anything. And then fold it back over again. And check. Look at that. Now you can't see that black thread. I mean, it was as easy as that. So I'm just going to do it a little bit more around my project just to make sure all of my binding sits really nicely. Don't want it twisted. Don't want it to be pulling too much. I mean, it's honestly, it's nothing to be like freaked out by or frustrated with. I mean, it's as simple as just a little shave. Just a little shave. Flip it back over again and let's test it out. Oh, so much better. Okay, we are in business. So using your Wonder Clips again, go ahead and clip everything in place, because we are going to do our final stitch and we're almost done. Good job. If you have not gone and joined my makers group yet, don't leave now to do it. You can do it afterwards. Wait for our special keyword, and then you can go and join it afterwards. I will then take stock of all of our people and put you in a random selector. There's a little bit of an edge right there that I'm going to fix. This can be a little messy right here because it's just this fluff stuff. I do want this to end up nice enough that I can give it to somebody or whatnot when I'm done with it. Okay, so I'm just going to push that off to the side. I'm going to use my stiletto. This is so helpful. See this like little string right here? I don't know how well you'll be able to see it when I get to it, but this stiletto, I can just run it and make that little string disappear. Just tuck it in. It is such a great tool. So I'm going to start again on a nice straightaway. This will let me get going and get started. I'm going to do a couple back stitches, get my stiletto in place, and do my 1/8 of an inch or so from my folded edge. Now, if you can get a good rhythm going around the corner without having to start or stop, you will always get a nicer stitch. If you can't, not a big deal. Start and stop. But if you can, it's just like a tension thing with your hands. Oops, that was a little wild. But I still think it will be better than if I started and stopped. Alrighty, that was it. Pulling it off. Clipping my threads. There was really only one place in that corner where I got a little wild and that I won't be like super happy with it, but you know what? No one's ever gonna notice but me. So there we go, our finished pot pincher that